Picture this. You are standing in the marble corridors of the Domus Aurea in Rome, 64 AD. The air is thick with incense and the metallic scent of fear. Through the gilded doorways you can hear the soft plucking of a lyre, a haunting melody that seems to mock the screams echoing from the streets below. The emperor sits in his private theatre, his plump fingers dancing across the strings while flames consume half the city. His eyes gleam with an artist's satisfaction as he watches his greatest performance unfold. Not on stage, but in the burning homes of a million souls. This is Nero, and tonight, Rome dies for his art. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please, comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The man who would become history's most notorious performer was born Lucius Domitius Aenobarbus in 37 AD, later adopted by Emperor Claudius, and renamed Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. But names meant nothing to him, only the spotlight. From his earliest days, Nero displayed an obsession with performance that would define his reign and destroy an empire. He didn't just want to rule, he wanted to be remembered as the greatest artist who ever lived. When Nero became emperor at 17 in 54 AD, Rome expected a young man who would grow into leadership. Instead, they got a ruler who treated the empire like his personal stage. He would force senators to attend his poetry readings, lasting 8 hours or more, with guards stationed at every exit to prevent escape. Those who dared to fall asleep would be carried out, feigning death to avoid his wrath. Others would pretend to give birth during his performances, knowing that only childbirth was considered a valid reason to leave. But Nero's true obsession was with the theatre. He performed in public, something so scandalous that it horrified the Roman elite. Emperors were gods, not entertainers. Yet there he stood, sweating under stage lights, his voice cracking as he sang tragic roles, his face painted with the masks of heroes and villains. He competed in chariot races, fixing the results so thoroughly that he once won a 10-horse race after falling off his chariot entirely. The judges still awarded him the victory crown. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD became his masterpiece. While ancient sources debate whether he started the fire himself, what's undeniable is his reaction. As flames devoured the city for 6 days and 7 nights, Nero saw opportunity. He commandeered a private stage and performed his own composition, The Sack of Troy, complete with costume changes and dramatic gestures, while citizens died in the streets below. Later, he would use the cleared land to build his golden house, a palace so vast it covered roughly 300 acres of central Rome, complete with an artificial lake and a 120-foot bronze statue of himself. Nero's appetite for performance extended to his personal life, with equally disturbing results. He kicked his pregnant wife Poppaea Sabina to death in 65 AD during a fit of rage, then married a young man named Sporus, whom he had castrated to resemble his dead wife. He forced Sporus to wear women's clothing, and took him as a bride in a formal ceremony, complete with wedding veils and dowry. But even this wasn't enough. He later married another man, Pythagoras, in a ceremony where Nero played the role of bride, complete with bridal veil and traditional wedding night. The emperor's final performance came in 68 AD, when rebellions across the empire closed the curtain on his reign. As enemy forces approached Rome, Nero couldn't bring himself to die by the sword like a proper Roman. Instead, he spent his final hours composing poetry and practicing dramatic death scenes. His last words, according to historian Suetonius, were, "What an artist dies in me, even in death, he couldn't escape the spotlight." From the ashes of Nero's Rome, we travel forward to the Syrian sun of 218 AD, where another young emperor would make Nero's excesses seem almost restrained. Elagabalus, born Varius Avitus Bassianus, became emperor at 14 through his grandmother's political maneuvering. But unlike Nero's artistic obsessions, Elagabalus was consumed by religious fervor and sexual experimentation that would shock even the jaded Roman elite. Elagabalus worshipped the sun god Elagabal, and he brought this Eastern deity to Rome with fanatical devotion. He built a massive temple on the Palatine Hill, and forced the Roman Senate to watch as he performed bizarre rituals. He would dance around the altar in silk robes, his face painted with cosmetics, castrating himself in religious ecstasy. Roman historians describe him circumcising himself and forcing others to do the same, turning the sacred rituals of Rome into performances of Eastern mysticism. But his religious practices were only the beginning. Elagabalus experimented with gender and sexuality in ways that scandalized Rome. He appeared in public wearing women's clothing, complete with makeup and jewelry. He asked physicians to transform him into a woman, reportedly offering vast sums of money to any doctor who could perform such a procedure. He married multiple wives and husbands, sometimes simultaneously, conducting ceremonies that mixed Roman traditions with Syrian customs. The emperor's marriage to Hierocles, a former slave and chariot driver, became one of his most notorious relationships. Elagabalus would address Hierocles as his husband, and took the role of wife, even wearing women's clothing during their private moments. Court observers noted that the emperor would paint his eyes with cosmetics and remove his body hair, presenting himself as feminine as possible. He allegedly operated a brothel from the imperial palace, personally soliciting customers and taking payment for his services. Elagabalus's reign lasted only 4 years, but his impact on Roman society was profound. He elevated his lovers to high positions, regardless of their qualifications. He appointed a chariot driver as prefect of the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal protection force. He made a former slave his chief advisor, while dismissing experienced senators and generals. The Roman elite watched in horror as their ancient traditions crumbled under the weight of an emperor who seemed determined to destroy everything they held sacred. The end came in 222 AD, when the Praetorian Guard, led by his own grandmother Julia Maesa, assassinated the 18-year-old emperor. His body was dragged through the streets of Rome, then thrown into the Tiber River. The Senate ordered his name removed from all official records, a punishment called damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Yet history remembered him anyway, as one of the most bizarre and controversial rulers in Roman history. The madness of absolute power reached perhaps its most extreme expression in Caligula, born Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus in 12 AD. His nickname Caligula came from the tiny military boots he wore as a child among his father's legions. But there was nothing childlike about the monster he became. When he assumed power in 37 AD, Romans celebrated, believing they were rid of the paranoid Tiberius. They had no idea they were trading one nightmare for another. Caligula's descent into madness began subtly. He restored democratic elections, freed political prisoners, and gave generous bonuses to the Praetorian Guard. But after falling seriously ill in 37 AD, he emerged from his sickbed transformed. Some historians believe he suffered from temporal lobe epilepsy, others suggest poisoning, but the cause mattered less than the result, an emperor who believed he was a living god. His first acts of divine madness involved conversations with statues. Palace servants reported finding him deep in discussion with the statue of Jupiter, sometimes arguing violently with the marble figure. He would cover the statue's head with a cloth when lightning struck, believing Jupiter was trying to frighten him. He built a bridge from his palace to the temple of Jupiter, so he could visit his fellow god more easily. Guards reported hearing him laughing and talking to invisible companions throughout the night. But Caligula's cruelty distinguished him from mere madness. He forced senators to run alongside his chariot for miles, then laugh as they collapsed from exhaustion. He made elderly nobles fight in gladiatorial contests, watching with delight as they struggled to lift their weapons. During one banquet, he suddenly burst into laughter. When his guests asked what amused him, he replied, "I just realized I could have you all killed with a single word." The laughter died in the dining hall. His treatment of his horse Incitatus became legendary. Caligula built the animal a marble stable with an ivory manger and purple blankets. He appointed the horse as a priest, and allegedly planned to make it a consul, one of Rome's highest offices. Dinner guests were required to speak to Incitatus with the same respect they showed the emperor. The horse ate from golden bowls and drank wine from jeweled goblets, while senators' families starved from Caligula's excessive taxation. The emperor's sexual appetites were equally disturbing. He committed incest with all 3 of his sisters, openly boasting about these relationships at public gatherings. He forced other senators to watch as he violated their wives and daughters, sometimes during dinner parties. He would send soldiers to drag women from their homes for his pleasure, then return them hours later, often describing in detail what he had done to their husbands and fathers. Caligula's building projects revealed his megalomaniacal nature. He began construction on a bridge across the Bay of Naples, nearly 3 miles long, simply so he could ride across it, wearing Alexander the Great's breastplate. He built a temporary bridge of boats across the bay, and rowed back and forth for days, throwing Roman citizens into the water when they failed to cheer loudly enough. The project bankrupted the treasury, and accomplished nothing except satisfying his desire for spectacle. His end came in 41 AD, when Cassius Charia, a Praetorian Guard officer, whom Caligula had repeatedly humiliated, led a conspiracy against him. They cornered the emperor in an underground passage beneath the palace, and stabbed him 30 times. His wife Caesonia and infant daughter were also murdered, to prevent any attempt at succession. The Senate attempted to restore the Republic, but the Praetorian Guard had already proclaimed Claudius emperor, ending the brief dream of freedom. From the marble halls of Rome we journey to the windswept steppes of the Mongol Empire, where Genghis Khan, born Temujin around 1162 AD, would unite the nomadic tribes through brutality that made Roman excess seem civilized. But his most bizarre habit wasn't his military tactics. It was his obsession with biological warfare and psychological torture that revealed a mind as calculating as it was cruel. Genghis Khan's rise from a tribal outcast to the ruler of the largest contiguous empire in history began with a simple philosophy: total submission or total destruction. But his methods of achieving this submission were far from simple. He perfected the art of terror as a weapon, using it to break enemies' will before the first arrow was fired. His most disturbing practice was the systematic use of plague victims as weapons of war. During the siege of Kaffa in 1347 AD, Mongol forces catapulted plague-infected corpses over the city walls, one of the first recorded uses of biological warfare. But this wasn't Genghis Khan's innovation. It was his successors copying techniques he had pioneered decades earlier. Khan's armies collected diseased animals and human corpses, storing them in specialized wagons that followed his forces. When attacking fortified cities, they would launch these rotting projectiles using giant catapults, spreading disease and terror simultaneously. The great Khan's personal habits were equally unsettling. He believed that washing would remove his spiritual power, so he rarely bathed and forbade his warriors from cleaning themselves during campaigns. The Mongol army moved across Asia like a plague of unwashed bodies, their smell preceding them by miles. Enemy scouts could track their movement by the stench alone. Khan believed this filth made his warriors more fearsome and spiritually powerful. His treatment of conquered peoples revealed a mind that understood psychological warfare better than any general before him. He would spare skilled craftsmen and engineers, but execute every man taller than a wagon wheel, ensuring that only the young and traumatized survived to spread terror. Children were forced to watch their parents' execution, then integrated into Mongol society as psychological weapons against their own people in future campaigns. Genghis Khan's sexual practices were systematically brutal. He maintained a harem of thousands of women, but his true obsession was the rape of enemy leaders' wives and daughters in front of their families. He believed that humiliating enemy males was more effective than killing them, as survivors would spread fear more effectively than martyrs. His armies were instructed to bring him the most beautiful women from every conquered city, not for pleasure, but as trophies of psychological domination. The Khan's death in 1227 AD was as mysterious as his life was brutal. Some sources claim he died from injuries sustained falling from a horse. Others suggest he was killed by a captured Tangut princess who concealed a blade during rape. His burial location remains unknown, as his followers killed anyone who witnessed the funeral procession. Over 800 people died to keep his grave secret, their bodies scattered across the steppes to prevent anyone from following the trail. Moving from the vast steppes of Asia to the stone castles of medieval Europe, we encounter Vlad III of Wallachia, known as Vlad the Impaler, born around 1431 AD. His name became synonymous with cruelty, inspiring the legend of Dracula, but the historical reality was far more disturbing than any vampire tale. Vlad's obsession with impalement wasn't random sadism. It was a carefully calculated psychological weapon designed to terrorize his enemies and maintain absolute control over his subjects. Vlad's introduction to cruelty came during his childhood captivity among the Ottoman Turks. From 1442 to 1448 AD, he lived as a hostage in the Ottoman court, watching as his captors used torture and execution as tools of statecraft. He studied their methods carefully, learning that fear was more effective than force. When he finally became ruler of Wallachia in 1456 AD, he applied these lessons with innovations that horrified even his Ottoman teachers. Impalement became his signature method of execution. But Vlad refined it into an art form. He would have victims stripped naked and forced onto sharpened stakes, carefully positioned to avoid vital organs and prolong suffering. The stakes were then raised vertically, allowing gravity to slowly drive the wood through the victim's body over several hours or days. Vlad would often dine among the dying, watching their faces as they slowly succumbed to their wounds. His most infamous display occurred in 1459 AD, when he impaled over 20,000 Ottoman prisoners outside the city of Targovishte. The forest of stakes stretched for miles, with bodies arranged by height and social status. Vlad positioned his dining table in the center of this human garden, hosting diplomatic meetings while surrounded by the slowly dying. Ottoman envoys reported that the smell of death and the sound of moaning victims made negotiation impossible, exactly as Vlad intended. But impalement was only one tool in his arsenal of psychological warfare. He would invite enemies to dinner, then have them seized and tortured in front of their families. He once invited several hundred nobles to a banquet, then had the doors sealed and the building burned with all the guests inside. He told survivors that he was cleaning the weeds from his garden. Those who escaped spread word of his methods, turning his reputation into a weapon that preceded his armies. Vlad's personal life reflected his public cruelty. He married twice, both times to women whose previous husbands he had killed. His first wife, whose name is lost to history, allegedly committed suicide by throwing herself from the castle tower rather than face capture by Ottoman forces. His second wife, Ilona Szilágyi, lived in constant fear of his moods. Court records describe her jumping at sudden sounds and refusing to eat food that hadn't been tested by servants. The ruler's obsession with cleanliness created a bizarre contrast to his bloody methods. He bathed multiple times daily and changed clothes frequently, as if trying to wash away the blood on his hands. He required his servants to maintain spotless conditions in his castle, executing those who failed to meet his standards. Visitors reported that his dining hall was immaculate, with fresh rushes on the floor and clean linens on the tables, even when surrounded by the stench of impaled victims outside. Vlad's end came in 1476 AD during a battle against the Ottomans. His own nobles, terrified of his unpredictable cruelty, abandoned him on the battlefield. His head was cut off and sent to the Ottoman Sultan in Constantinople, where it was displayed on a stake, a fitting end for the man who had killed thousands in the same manner. His body was buried in a monastery, but the exact location remains unknown, as monks feared his spirit might return to torment the living. From the blood-soaked battlefields of Wallachia, we travel to the sun-baked deserts of the Aztec Empire, where Moctezuma II, born around 1466 AD, ruled over millions of subjects through a combination of religious devotion and ceremonial brutality that made European monarchs seem restrained. His most bizarre habit wasn't his famous collection of exotic animals. It was his obsession with human sacrifice as a form of divine communication, conducted with ritualistic precision that revealed a mind completely consumed by religious delusion. Moctezuma II became the 9th Aztec emperor in 1502 AD, ruling from his magnificent capital of Tenochtitlan, a city that Spanish conquistadors would later describe as more beautiful than any European capital. But beneath the beauty lay a civilization built on systematic human sacrifice, with Moctezuma serving as both priest and emperor in ceremonies that consumed thousands of lives annually. The emperor's daily routine began before dawn with ritual bloodletting. He would pierce his ears, tongue, and genitals with obsidian blades, collecting the blood in jade bowls as offerings to the gods. Court observers described him as entering a trance-like state during these sessions, speaking to invisible deities and receiving instructions for the day's activities. His servants collected every drop of his blood, believing it contained divine power that could influence the weather and ensure good harvests. Moctezuma's zoo was legendary, housing creatures from across the empire in elaborate enclosures. But his most disturbing collection wasn't animals, it was human beings. He maintained a menagerie of dwarfs, hunchbacks, and people with other physical deformities, whom he displayed for visitors and used in religious ceremonies. These individuals were treated as living sacrifices, their unusual appearance believed to make them more pleasing to the gods. He would often have them killed during important festivals, their hearts removed while still beating. The emperor's dietary habits reflected his religious obsessions. He ate only foods that had been blessed by priests and tested by food tasters, not for poison but for spiritual purity. He believed that consuming impure food would anger the gods and bring disaster to his empire. His meals included chocolate drinks mixed with human blood, particularly from sacrificed children, which he believed enhanced his divine powers. Spanish chroniclers reported that he would drink this mixture while watching prisoner executions, his eyes glazing over as he entered religious ecstasy. Moctezuma's treatment of prisoners revealed the systematic nature of Aztec sacrifice. He maintained elaborate prison complexes, where captives were fattened for sacrifice, their diet carefully controlled to ensure their flesh would be pleasing to the gods. He personally selected victims for major ceremonies, examining their bodies for physical perfection and signs of divine favor. Those chosen for sacrifice were treated as honored guests until their execution, given fine clothes and elaborate meals in their final days. The emperor's most infamous ceremony was the dedication of the rebuilt Templo Mayor in 1487 AD, where historical accounts suggest that over 20,000 prisoners were sacrificed over 4 days. Moctezuma personally performed many of these executions, using obsidian knives to cut out beating hearts, which he then offered to the statue of Huitzilopochtli, the god of war. The steps of the temple were painted red with blood, and the smell of death permeated the city for weeks afterward. His relationship with the Spanish conquistadors revealed the depth of his religious delusion. When Hernán Cortés arrived in 1519 AD, Moctezuma believed he was the returning god Quetzalcoatl, as predicted by Aztec prophecy. He welcomed the Spanish with elaborate ceremonies, offering them gold and precious stones, while his advisors warned that these strangers intended to conquer his empire. His religious faith blinded him to the obvious threat, and he became a prisoner in his own palace. Moctezuma's death in 1520 AD remains controversial. Spanish sources claim he was killed by stones thrown by his own people during a rebellion, while Aztec accounts suggest the Spanish murdered him directly. What's certain is that his religious obsessions and inability to adapt to new realities contributed to the fall of one of history's greatest civilizations. The emperor, who believed he could speak to gods, couldn't recognize human treachery when it stood before him. Across the Atlantic, in the court of France, we encounter Charles VI, born in 1368 AD, whose reign from 1380 to 1422 AD was marked by periods of complete madness that earned him the nickname Charles the Mad. His bizarre behavior wasn't the calculated cruelty of other rulers, it was the product of a mind that had completely lost touch with reality, creating a court where courtiers never knew if their king would embrace them or try to murder them. Charles VI's first major episode of madness occurred in 1392 AD during a military campaign in Brittany. While riding through the forest of Le Mans, he suddenly drew his sword and began attacking his own knights, killing 4 men before being subdued. Witnesses reported that he didn't recognize his own brother and screamed that enemies were pursuing him. This episode marked the beginning of a mental deterioration that would last for the rest of his reign. During his periods of madness, Charles believed he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. He had iron rods sewn into his clothing to prevent breaking and refused to allow anyone to come near him. Court physicians tried various treatments, including loud noises, to shock him back to sanity, but these only made his condition worse. He would spend hours standing perfectly still, convinced that any movement would cause him to shatter into pieces. The king's identity delusions were equally disturbing. He sometimes forgot his own name and insisted he was not the King of France, but a poor servant named George. During these episodes, he would refuse to change his clothes or bathe, believing that such luxuries were inappropriate for a commoner. He once didn't change his clothes for 5 months, his garments becoming so filthy that servants had to cut them away while he slept. Charles's fear of his own existence extended to his family. He didn't recognize his wife, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, and became violent when she tried to approach him. He refused to acknowledge his children, insisting they were impostors sent by his enemies. During one episode, he barricaded himself in his chambers for weeks, convinced that his family was trying to poison him. He would only eat food prepared by a single trusted servant, and even then he would make the servant eat first to ensure it wasn't poisoned. The king's attempts to escape his own body led to increasingly bizarre behavior. He would run through the palace corridors, trying to outrun his own shadow, convinced it was a demon pursuing him. He once attempted to burn down his own chambers, believing that fire would purify him of evil spirits. Guards had to wrestle him away from the flames, his hair and beard singed from the heat. His lucid periods were almost more disturbing than his madness. During these moments, Charles would remember his actions and become consumed with guilt and horror. He would weep for hours, begging forgiveness from those he had attacked and trying to make amends for his behavior. But these moments of clarity were brief, and he would inevitably slip back into delusion, each time emerging more damaged than before. The political consequences of Charles's madness were catastrophic for France. During his incapacitation, the kingdom fell into civil war between the Armagnacs and Burgundians, noble factions fighting for control of the regency. The English took advantage of this chaos, conquering much of northern France during the 100 Years' War. Charles's madness didn't just affect his court, it nearly destroyed his kingdom. Charles VI died in 1422 AD, his mind broken by 30 years of intermittent madness. His son, the future Charles VII, would spend decades recovering the territories lost during his father's illness. The Mad King's legacy served as a stark reminder that royal blood offered no protection against mental illness, and that a ruler's personal demons could become a nation's nightmare. From the troubled courts of medieval France, we journey to the harsh landscape of 16th century Russia, where Ivan IV, known as Ivan the Terrible, born in 1530 AD, would earn his fearsome reputation through a combination of paranoid delusion and systematic cruelty that made previous tyrants seem almost benevolent. His most bizarre habit wasn't his famous fits of rage, it was his obsession with religious ritual combined with sexual violence that revealed a mind completely consumed by contradictions. Ivan became Grand Prince of Moscow at age 3 following his father's death, but his true education came from the boyars, nobles, who served as his regents. These men treated the young ruler as a pawn in their power games, alternately coddling and abusing him depending on their political needs. Ivan later recalled watching these same men who bowed to him publicly torture and execute their rivals, teaching him that cruelty was the language of power. His first act of independent rule came at age 13 when he ordered the execution of Andrei Shuisky, a boyar who had humiliated him. Ivan didn't simply have him killed, he had him thrown to a pack of hunting dogs, then watched as they tore the man apart. The other boyars were forced to witness this execution, learning that their young ruler had absorbed their lessons about fear and control all too well. Ivan's obsession with religious ritual created a bizarre contrast to his violent nature. He would spend hours in prayer, prostrating himself before icons, until his forehead bled from striking the stone floor. He memorized vast portions of religious texts and could quote scripture during his most violent rages. Witnesses described him, alternating between prayers and executions, sometimes in the same breath, as if seeking divine approval for his cruelty. The creation of the Oprichnina in 1565 AD marked Ivan's complete descent into paranoid madness. This was his personal army of black-clad horsemen who carried symbols of a dog's head and a broom, representing their mission to bite and sweep away the Tsar's enemies. The Oprichniks were given unlimited power to torture and execute anyone Ivan suspected of treason, which eventually included most of the Russian nobility. Ivan's sexual appetites were as disturbing as his political methods. He maintained a harem of hundreds of women, but his true pleasure came from rape and murder. He would have young women brought to his chambers, then torture them sexually before having them killed. His guards reported hearing screams from his private rooms at all hours, followed by the sound of bodies being dragged away. He once boasted to foreign ambassadors that he had enjoyed over 1,000 virgins, though he admitted that most hadn't survived the experience. His treatment of his own family revealed the depth of his madness. In 1581 AD, during a fit of rage, he struck his son and heir Ivan Ivanovich with his metal-tipped staff, fracturing the young man's skull. As his son lay dying, Ivan alternated between grief and fury, praying for forgiveness while raging at the boyars he blamed for his son's death. The prince died 3 days later, leaving Ivan without a competent heir, and Russia facing a succession crisis. The Tsar's final years were marked by increasing paranoia and religious obsession. He took monastic vows while continuing his violent rule, believing that becoming a monk would cleanse him of his sins while allowing him to continue his earthly reign. He wore a hair shirt under his royal robes and spent hours in prayer, but these religious practices only seemed to fuel his cruelty rather than restrain it. Ivan's death in 1584 AD came while he was playing chess with a boyar Boris Godunov. He suddenly collapsed, possibly from a stroke, though some historians suggest poison. His last words were reportedly a prayer for forgiveness, but his legacy of terror would haunt Russia for generations. The time of troubles that followed his death nearly destroyed the Russian state, as various factions fought for control of the throne he had weakened through his paranoid rule. From the frozen steppes of Russia, we travel to the opulent court of the Ottoman Empire, where Ibrahim I, born in 1615 AD, earned the title Ibrahim the Mad, through a combination of sexual obsession and religious delusion that would make him one of history's most bizarre rulers. His reign from 1640 to 1648 AD was marked by an insatiable appetite for women, and a complete disconnection from reality that nearly destroyed one of the world's most powerful empires. Ibrahim's path to madness began in childhood, when he spent his early years confined to the palace's cage, a luxurious prison where potential heirs were kept to prevent them from challenging the reigning sultan. For 22 years he lived in this golden captivity, his only companions eunuchs and concubines, his only entertainment books and musical instruments. This isolation from the real world created a mind that confused fantasy with reality, pleasure with power. When Ibrahim became sultan in 1640 AD following his brother Murad IV's death, he emerged from his cage completely unprepared for rule. His first act was to demand that his entire harem be replaced with new women, as he believed the previous concubines had been contaminated by his brother's presence. He sent agents throughout the empire to collect the most beautiful women, regardless of their social status or marital situation, building a harem that eventually contained over 1,000 women. His obsession with female beauty reached pathological extremes. Ibrahim would spend entire days examining his concubines naked, ranking them by various physical attributes and keeping detailed records of their measurements. He developed specific fetishes for different body types, at one point becoming obsessed with overweight women after falling in love with a 330-pound concubine nicknamed Sugar Cube. He issued imperial decrees requiring all provinces to send him their heaviest women, believing that obesity was a sign of divine favor. The Sultan's daily routine revolved entirely around sexual gratification. He would wake each morning and select different women for elaborate sexual games, often involving multiple partners simultaneously. Palace servants reported that he would sometimes spend 12 hours in his private chambers, emerging only to eat or pray. His sexual appetite was so voracious that palace physicians constantly treated him for exhaustion and dehydration. Ibrahim's treatment of his concubines revealed the cruelty beneath his obsession. He would have women sewn into leather bags and thrown into the Bosphorus if they displeased him, believing that drowning would purify their souls. He once ordered the execution of his entire harem, nearly 300 women, because he suspected one of them of infidelity. The mass drowning took 3 days to complete, with palace guards rowing boats full of struggling women to the deepest parts of the strait. His spending on luxury items for his harem bankrupted the empire. He covered the walls of his private chambers with sable fur, costing more than the annual revenue of several provinces. He had pillows stuffed with crushed pearls, and imported rare perfumes from across the known world. He commissioned a throne made entirely of amber, and had his bathing pools filled with rosewater and milk. Meanwhile, his soldiers went unpaid, and his subjects starved from excessive taxation. The Sultan's religious practices were as bizarre as his sexual obsessions. He believed that his lust was divinely inspired, and that satisfying his sexual desires was a form of worship. He would pray before entering his harem, asking Allah to bless his activities and grant him greater stamina. He commissioned religious scholars to write treatises justifying his behavior, paying them enormous sums to find passages in Islamic law that supported his lifestyle. Ibrahim's disconnection from reality became complete when he decided to personally lead a military campaign against Crete in 1645 AD. He had never seen a battle and had no military experience, but he believed his divine protection would ensure victory. He spent months preparing for the campaign by having his concubines dress as soldiers and stage mock battles in the palace gardens. When advisors tried to explain the realities of warfare, he had them executed for undermining imperial confidence. The end came in 1648 AD when the Janissaries, the empire's elite soldiers, finally lost patience with his incompetence. They stormed the palace and dragged him from his chambers, where he was found cowering among his concubines. His own mother, the Valide Sultan, reportedly gave permission for his execution, saying that he had brought shame to the Ottoman dynasty. He was strangled with a silk cord, the traditional method for executing Ottoman royalty, while his terrified concubines watched from behind their veils. From the perfumed chambers of the Ottoman court, we journey to the court of 17th century France, where Louis XIV, born in 1638 AD, would earn the title Sun King through an obsession with ceremony and control that transformed absolute monarchy into a bizarre theatrical performance. His reign from 1643 to 1715 AD was marked by ritualistic behavior so extreme that it turned every aspect of daily life into a stage production, with courtiers as unwilling actors in his grandiose delusion. Louis XIV's obsession with ceremony began in childhood, when his mother Anne of Austria and chief minister Cardinal Mazarin used elaborate court rituals to maintain royal authority during the regency. The young king learned that every gesture, every word, every moment of his existence was a performance that reinforced his divine right to rule. By the time he reached adulthood, he had internalized this lesson so completely that he couldn't distinguish between public performance and private reality. The king's morning routine, known as the lever, became a sacred ritual that could take up to 2 hours. 24 courtiers had specific roles in his awakening ceremony, from the duke who had the honor of pulling back the bed curtains to the prince who handed him his shirt. Each action was performed in precise order, with participants bowing at specific moments and speaking only when addressed directly. The king would sit motionless during this ceremony, his face expressionless, as if he were a statue being dressed by worshippers. His eating habits were equally ritualized. Every meal became a public performance, with specific courtiers assigned to taste his food, serve his wine, and even hand him his napkin. He never ate in private, believing that dining was a royal duty that should be witnessed by his subjects. The king would consume enormous quantities of food, often 4 bowls of soup, a whole chicken, multiple cuts of meat, and several desserts, while maintaining perfect posture and royal composure. Courtiers were required to stand throughout these meals, sometimes for hours, while he ate in regal silence. Louis XIV's obsession with his own appearance reached pathological levels. He spent hours each morning in front of mirrors, examining his face for signs of aging or imperfection. He wore elaborate wigs that cost more than most nobles' annual income, some standing over 2 feet tall and requiring special doorways in palace rooms. His collection of over 1,000 wigs was maintained by a staff of 40 wigmakers who worked exclusively for the royal household. He changed his clothes up to 6 times daily, each outfit requiring a formal ceremony with specific protocols for dressing and undressing. The construction of Versailles became his ultimate expression of controlled reality. He transformed a modest hunting lodge into the most magnificent palace in Europe, but his true innovation was creating a court system that turned nobility into prisoners of ceremony. Every aspect of life at Versailles was regulated by Byzantine protocols that kept the aristocracy focused on trivial matters while he consolidated absolute power. Nobles competed for the privilege of watching him eat, sleep, and use the bathroom, their former independence replaced by desperate hunger for royal attention. His courtiers' lives became nightmarish performances. The Duchess of Burgundy once collapsed during a lever ceremony, but was forbidden to leave until the king dismissed her. She stood for 3 hours with a broken ankle, her face pale with pain, while Louis XIV continued his routine unchanged. The Duke of Saint-Simon recorded that courtiers would soil themselves, rather than risk leaving a ceremony without permission, their desperation hidden behind elaborate court dress and powdered faces. Louis XIV's sexual habits were as regulated as his court ceremonies. He maintained official mistresses in addition to his 2 wives, but even these relationships followed strict protocols. His lovers were required to participate in court ceremonies and maintain specific roles in the royal household. Madame de Montespan, his most famous mistress, was forced to attend mass with the queen and participate in religious ceremonies while publicly known as the king's lover. This bizarre arrangement created a court where adultery was institutionalized and sanctified through ceremony. The king's death in 1715 AD revealed the ultimate emptiness of his theatrical reign. He had created a system so focused on performance that it had lost touch with reality. His successors inherited a bankrupt kingdom, a resentful nobility, and a population that had forgotten how to govern itself. The elaborate ceremonies that had sustained his reign for 72 years collapsed within decades, leading to the French Revolution and the execution of his descendant Louis XVI. From the gilded halls of Versailles, we cross the English Channel to encounter Henry VIII, born in 1491 AD, whose reign from 1509 to 1547 AD was marked by an obsession with marriage and divorce that would split England from the Catholic Church and create a legacy of terror that made him one of history's most feared monarchs. His bizarre habit wasn't just his 6 marriages, It was his systematic use of execution as a solution to personal problems, turning the Tower of London into his private divorce court. Henry VIII began his reign as a golden prince, handsome and athletic, beloved by his subjects and praised by European courts. But his inability to produce a male heir with his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, triggered a psychological transformation that would define his reign. His obsession with male succession wasn't just political. It was a personal torment that consumed his thoughts and drove him to increasingly desperate measures. The king's break with Rome in 1534 AD over his divorce from Catherine revealed the extremes he would pursue to satisfy his desires. He declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, not from religious conviction but from sexual frustration. He systematically destroyed England's monasteries, seizing their wealth and land, but his true innovation was using theological arguments to justify personal vendettas. He executed Thomas More and John Fisher, two of England's most respected scholars, simply because they wouldn't acknowledge his authority over the Pope. His treatment of his wives revealed a pattern of obsession followed by murderous rage. Anne Boleyn, whom he pursued for 7 years and married in secret, was executed on charges of adultery and treason after failing to produce a male heir. The evidence against her was fabricated, but Henry convinced himself of her guilt through his own paranoid delusions. He watched her execution from his palace window, then celebrated their daughter Elizabeth's illegitimacy within hours of her mother's death. Henry's physical transformation paralleled his psychological deterioration. By middle age he had grown enormously fat, his legs covered with festering ulcers that gave off a smell so putrid that courtiers could detect his presence from rooms away. His armor had to be constantly enlarged, and he required mechanical lifts to mount his horse. Yet he maintained the delusion that he was still the athletic prince of his youth, commissioning portraits that showed him as slim and powerful, while his actual body was grotesque and diseased. The king's paranoia reached its peak during his marriage to his fifth wife, Catherine Howard. When he discovered her previous relationships, he flew into such a rage that witnesses feared for their own safety. He had her executed along with her alleged lovers, but his fury didn't end there. He executed anyone who had known about her past and failed to inform him, including elderly servants who had worked for her family. The purge consumed dozens of lives, all because a teenage girl had been sexually active before marriage. Henry's final years were marked by increasing isolation and cruelty. He slept with a loaded crossbow beside his bed, convinced that assassins were lurking in the palace shadows. He had his food tasted by multiple servants, and changed his sleeping chambers randomly to avoid poison. His courtiers lived in constant fear of his moods, knowing that a careless word could result in execution. The Tower of London's execution block was worn smooth from use during his reign. His death in 1547 AD came from complications related to his obesity and infected leg ulcers. His last words were reportedly, "Monks, monks, monks," perhaps a reference to the religious men he had destroyed during his break with Rome. He left behind a kingdom transformed by his personal obsessions, a daughter who would become one of England's greatest queens, and a legacy of terror that would influence English monarchy for centuries. From the English court we journey to the mountains of Wallachia to encounter another member of the Dracul family, Radu the Handsome, born around 1437 AD, younger brother of Vlad the Impaler. His bizarre habits weren't marked by his brother's cruelty, but by a complete submission to his Ottoman captors that earned him the throne of Wallachia, while destroying his soul. His reign from 1462 to 1475 AD was characterized by sexual submission and cultural betrayal that made him one of history's most psychologically complex rulers. Radu's transformation began during his childhood captivity, alongside his brother Vlad in the Ottoman court. While Vlad learned cruelty and resistance, Radu chose accommodation and submission. He converted to Islam, learned Turkish and Arabic, and eventually became a favorite of Sultan Mehmed II. But his relationship with the Sultan went beyond political alliance. Historical sources suggest a sexual relationship that shaped his entire worldview and political philosophy. His unusual name, the Handsome, reflected his physical beauty and his use of sexuality as a political weapon. Ottoman chroniclers described him as exceptionally attractive, with fair skin and delicate features that made him popular among both men and women at court. He used his appearance to gain influence, reportedly serving as the Sultan's lover while maintaining relationships with other powerful Ottoman officials. His beauty became his primary political asset, a tool he wielded with calculated precision. When Radu became ruler of Wallachia in 1462 AD, he brought Ottoman customs to his Christian kingdom with an enthusiasm that shocked his subjects. He built mosques in Wallachian cities, invited Turkish settlers to colonize his lands, and implemented Islamic law alongside traditional Romanian customs. His court became a bizarre hybrid of Christian and Islamic traditions, with Orthodox priests serving alongside Muslim clerics in ceremonies that confused and disturbed his subjects. His relationship with his brother Vlad created one of history's most psychologically complex sibling rivalries. While Vlad impaled thousands of Ottoman prisoners, Radu welcomed Ottoman settlers with open arms. They fought multiple battles against each other, with Radu leading Ottoman forces against his own brother's army. The psychological toll of this conflict was evident in Radu's behavior. He would reportedly weep after victories against Vlad's forces, torn between loyalty to his benefactors and love for his brother. Radu's sexual practices reflected his psychological submission to Ottoman authority. He maintained a harem of both men and women, modeled on the Sultan's court, but his primary relationships were with Ottoman officials and visiting dignitaries. He used sexual favors as diplomatic tools, hosting elaborate parties where political negotiations occurred alongside sexual encounters. His court became known throughout the Ottoman Empire as a place where any pleasure could be obtained for the right price. The ruler's treatment of his Christian subjects revealed the depth of his cultural transformation. He forced Orthodox churches to include Islamic prayers in their services and required Christian nobles to learn Turkish. He appointed Muslim administrators to govern Christian villages and imposed Ottoman taxation systems that enriched Turkish merchants while impoverishing his own people. His subjects began to see him not as their king but as a Turkish puppet who had sold his soul for power. Radu's death in 1475 AD came during a final attempt to reconcile with his brother Vlad. Historical accounts suggest he was poisoned by his own nobles, who had grown tired of his pro-Ottoman policies. His final words were reportedly spoken in Turkish, not Romanian, symbolizing his complete cultural transformation. He was buried according to Islamic rites, despite being born Christian, his grave facing Mecca rather than Jerusalem. From the cultural confusion of medieval Wallachia, we travel to the sophisticated courts of medieval Baghdad, where Hakim Bai Amr Allah, born around 985 AD, ruled the Fatimid Caliphate from 996 to 1021 AD, with a combination of religious fanaticism and personal eccentricity that made him one of history's most bizarre rulers. His reign was marked by random prohibitions, architectural obsessions, and claims of divinity that revealed a mind completely disconnected from reality. Al-Hakim's rise to power came at age 11 following his father's death, but his education was overseen by eunuchs and religious scholars who filled his mind with mystical theories and apocalyptic prophecies. He became convinced that he was a divine incarnation, the final imam prophesied to appear before the end of times. This delusion shaped every aspect of his rule, from his bizarre laws to his treatment of his subjects. His first act as an independent ruler was to prohibit the consumption of certain vegetables, believing that foods with strong flavors corrupted the soul. He banned onions, garlic, and leeks throughout his territory, with violators subject to severe punishment. He then extended these prohibitions to include grapes, honey, and various spices, creating a dietary system so restrictive that his subjects struggled to find acceptable food. His reasoning was that bland food purified the spirit and prepared believers for spiritual enlightenment. Al-Hakim's obsession with controlling human behavior extended to bizarre regulations governing daily life. He prohibited people from working during daylight hours, believing that darkness was more spiritually pure than sunlight. He banned women from leaving their homes except during specific hours, and required them to wear veils so thick they could barely see. He prohibited the making of women's shoes, believing that the sound of female footsteps was sexually provocative and distracted men from religious contemplation. The Caliph's architectural projects revealed his megalomania and disconnection from practical reality. He began construction on the Hall of Wisdom, intended to be the largest library in the world, but his plans were so grandiose that the building was never completed. He ordered the construction of numerous mosques, but each had to be built according to his specific visions, which he claimed came from divine revelation. Many of these structures were demolished and rebuilt multiple times when he received new revelations about their proper design. His treatment of religious minorities reflected his unstable personality. He alternately persecuted and protected Christians and Jews depending on his mood and his latest mystical insights. He once ordered the destruction of all churches and synagogues in his territory, then reversed the decision and paid for their reconstruction. He forced Christians to wear heavy wooden crosses and required Jews to wear distinctive clothing, then abolished these requirements and invited persecuted minorities to serve in his administration. Al-Hakim's claims of divinity reached their peak when he declared himself the final incarnation of God on earth. He required his subjects to prostrate themselves in his presence and commissioned religious scholars to write treatises proving his divine nature. He claimed to perform miracles and insisted that his dreams were prophetic visions that revealed God's will. His followers, known as Druze, still exist today and consider him a divine figure, though most contemporary Muslims viewed him as a dangerous heretic. The Caliph's mysterious disappearance in 1021 AD, while riding alone in the desert, has never been explained. Some historians believe he was murdered by his own guards. Others suggest he staged his own death to escape the pressures of rule. His blood-stained clothes were found on a hillside, but his body was never recovered. His followers claimed he had ascended to heaven, while his enemies celebrated his apparent death. The truth died with him in the desert sands. From the mystical courts of medieval Cairo, we journey to the harsh landscapes of 18th century Afghanistan, where Ahmad Shah Durrani, born around 1722 AD, founded the Durrani Empire through a combination of military genius and personal habits, so bizarre they became legend among his own troops. His reign from 1747 to 1772 AD was marked by an obsession with his own beard and a collection of severed heads that he treated as trusted advisors. Ahmad Shah's rise to power began with the assassination of Nadir Shah of Persia in 1747 AD. As commander of Nadir's Afghan bodyguard, Ahmad could have been killed alongside his master, but his reputation for personal cleanliness and his magnificent beard saved his life. Persian nobles, impressed by his grooming habits and his treatment of his facial hair as a sacred object, allowed him to return to Afghanistan with a portion of Nadir's treasury. His obsession with his beard went far beyond normal grooming. He would spend hours each morning oiling and braiding his facial hair, which eventually grew to reach his waist. He employed a team of specialist barbers whose only job was maintaining his beard, washing it with imported oils and perfumes, and ensuring that not a single hair was damaged or displaced. He believed his beard contained his spiritual power, and that damaging it would cause his empire to collapse. Ahmad Shah's collection of severed heads began as a military practice but evolved into something far more disturbing. After each victory, he would personally select the heads of enemy commanders and have them preserved using techniques learned from Persian court physicians. These heads were then mounted on stakes in his tent, where he would hold conversations with them before making important decisions. His officers reported hearing him asking the heads for military advice and seeming to listen to their responses. The king's daily routine involved consulting his collection of preserved heads before making any major decision. He named each head according to the deceased's rank and accomplishments, treating them as a council of war advisors. Visitors to his court were horrified to see him speaking earnestly to rotting skulls, their eye sockets empty and their flesh mummified, while he nodded, as if receiving valuable counsel. His soldiers began to believe their king could communicate with the dead. His treatment of living advisors was equally strange. Ahmad Shah would only accept advice from men who had never cut their beards, believing that facial hair was connected to wisdom and spiritual power. He dismissed experienced generals who trimmed their beards and promoted younger officers based solely on the length and thickness of their facial hair. His court became populated with heavily bearded men of questionable competence, their long facial hair, their primary qualification for high office. Ahmad Shah's military tactics incorporated his psychological peculiarities with devastating effect. Before battles, he would display his collection of heads to enemy forces, claiming that the spirits of dead warriors fought alongside his army. He would ride into battle with several preserved heads attached to his saddle, their empty sockets seeming to stare at his enemies. This psychological warfare was remarkably effective, as many opposing forces fled rather than face an army led by a man who spoke to the dead. His personal hygiene extended beyond his beard to encompass his entire body. He bathed multiple times daily using water imported from specific mountain springs, believing that cleanliness was connected to military victory. He required his soldiers to maintain similar standards, making the Afghan army possibly the cleanest military force of its era. His enemies often detected their approach by the smell of soap and perfumed oils, rather than the usual odors of unwashed warriors. Ahmad Shah's death. in 1772 AD, was as bizarre as his life. He died of cancer, but spent his final weeks giving detailed instructions for the preservation of his own head, wanting to ensure he could continue advising his successors from beyond the grave. His son Timur Shah followed these instructions, keeping his father's preserved head in the royal palace for several years, before finally burying it according to Islamic law. The empire Ahmad had built through his strange genius collapsed within decades of his death. From the mountains of Afghanistan we travel to the palaces of 16th century India, where Akbar the Great, born in 1542 AD, ruled the Mughal Empire from 1556 to 1605 AD, with a combination of religious tolerance and personal eccentricity that made him one of history's most complex rulers. His bizarre habit wasn't cruelty or excess. It was his obsession with creating a new religion that combined elements of every faith he encountered, turning his court into a theological laboratory where he played the role of divine prophet. Akbar's religious experimentation began with his education under multiple tutors representing different faiths. He learned from Muslim scholars, Hindu priests, Christian missionaries, Zoroastrian teachers, and Buddhist monks, absorbing elements from each tradition while rejecting their claims to exclusive truth. By adulthood, he had developed a syncretic worldview that saw all religions as partial expressions of a single divine truth that only he could fully understand. His creation of the Din-i-Ilahi, religion of God, in 1582 AD represented the culmination of his theological ambitions. This new faith combined Islamic monotheism, Hindu reincarnation, Christian morality, and Zoroastrian fire worship into a system that Akbar claimed had been revealed to him directly by God. He appointed himself as the religion's prophet and required his closest courtiers to convert, though he never forced the practice on his broader subjects. The emperor's daily routine revolved around religious debate and experimentation. He built the Ibad Khana, house of worship, where representatives of different faiths would engage in theological discussions while he listened and offered his own interpretations. These sessions could last for hours, with Akbar questioning priests and scholars about their beliefs while developing his own theories about divine truth. He took detailed notes during these debates, compiling them into religious texts that formed the foundation of his new faith. Akbar's treatment of religious art reflected his syncretic approach. He commissioned paintings that depicted Hindu gods alongside Islamic calligraphy, Christian symbols next to Buddhist iconography. His court artists created works that would have been considered blasphemous by orthodox believers of any faith, but which Akbar saw as expressions of universal truth. He personally designed religious ceremonies that incorporated elements from multiple traditions, creating rituals that confused and sometimes horrified visitors to his court. His marriage practices reflected his religious philosophy. He married Hindu, Muslim, and Christian wives, not just for political alliance but to demonstrate the unity of different faiths under his rule. Each wife was allowed to practice her own religion, and Akbar would participate in their various religious ceremonies, seeing them as different paths to the same divine truth. His court became a living example of religious tolerance that was unprecedented in the medieval world. The emperor's intellectual curiosity extended to his approach to governance. He abolished the jizya tax on non-Muslims, promoted religious minorities to high positions, and established a system of administration that valued competence over religious affiliation. His empire became a refuge for persecuted religious minorities from across Asia, as his reputation for tolerance spread among communities facing religious persecution elsewhere. Akbar's death, in 1605 AD, marked the end of one of history's most remarkable experiments in religious synthesis. His son Jahangir abandoned the Din-i-Ilahi and returned to Orthodox Islam, but the legacy of religious tolerance that Akbar had established continued to influence Mughal policy for generations. His tomb in Sikandra reflects his syncretic vision, combining Islamic, Hindu, and Christian architectural elements in a structure that seems to embody his belief in the unity of all faiths. From the religious experiments of Mughal India, we journey to the windswept highlands of Scotland, where David I, born around 1084 AD, ruled from 1124 to 1153 AD, with a combination of religious devotion and personal habits, so extreme they earned him sainthood while nearly bankrupting his kingdom. His bizarre obsession wasn't with power or pleasure, it was with founding religious institutions and giving away royal lands to achieve personal salvation, treating his kingdom like a vast monastery with himself as its chief monk. David's religious mania began during his youth at the Anglo-Norman court, where he was exposed to continental European monasticism and the reformist movement within the Catholic Church. He became convinced that royal power was a burden that endangered his soul unless used exclusively for religious purposes. Upon becoming king, he embarked on a program of monastery building that transformed Scotland, but nearly destroyed the royal treasury. His daily routine resembled that of a monk more than a king. He woke before dawn for private prayers, attended multiple masses throughout the day, and spent hours copying religious manuscripts by hand. He wore a hair shirt under his royal robes and fasted so frequently that his courtiers worried about his health. He slept on a simple straw mattress in a bare cell within his palace, surrounding himself with religious symbols rather than royal luxury. The king's obsession with founding religious institutions reached extraordinary proportions. During his 29-year reign, he established over 20 major monasteries and countless smaller religious houses. He gave these institutions vast tracts of royal land, often the most fertile and valuable territories in Scotland. By the end of his reign, the church owned nearly 1/3 of all Scottish land, making it wealthier than the crown itself. David's approach to justice reflected his religious worldview. He established church courts alongside royal courts, often deferring to religious authorities in matters that traditionally fell under royal jurisdiction. He required all his officials to take religious vows and insisted that secular law conform to church doctrine. His kingdom became a theocracy in all but name, with bishops wielding more practical power than nobles. His treatment of money revealed the depth of his religious conviction. He gave away enormous sums to religious causes, funding the construction of elaborate churches and monasteries, while his own castles fell into disrepair. He refused to collect certain taxes, believing that royal wealth was spiritually corrupting. He personally distributed alms to the poor, sometimes giving away his own clothing to beggars, much to the horror of his courtiers. The king's marriage to Matilda of Huntingdon was conducted more like a religious ceremony than a royal wedding. He insisted that their relationship remain celibate, except for the minimum necessary to produce an heir, viewing sexual pleasure as incompatible with his spiritual goals. Their court was described by visitors as resembling a monastery more than a palace, with constant prayers, religious ceremonies, and theological discussions, replacing the usual entertainments of medieval royalty. David's military campaigns were conceived as religious crusades rather than political conquests. He fought against pagan tribes on Scotland's borders, but his primary goal was conversion rather than conquest. He established churches in newly conquered territories before building castles, and he insisted that captured enemies be offered conversion before execution. His army included more priests than professional soldiers. His death in 1153 AD came while he was praying in his private chapel. His last words were reportedly a prayer for the souls of his enemies, and he was found kneeling before a crucifix, his hands clasped in prayer. The Catholic Church canonized him as Saint David I, recognizing his extraordinary devotion, but his successors inherited a kingdom so weakened by his religious generosity that it took generations to restore royal authority. Our final journey takes us to the bizarre court of the Holy Roman Empire, where Rudolf II, born in 1552 AD, ruled from 1576 to 1612 AD with an obsession for alchemy, astrology, and the occult that transformed his court into Europe's strangest intellectual center. His reign was marked by a complete withdrawal from political reality into a world of magical thinking and scientific experimentation that made him one of history's most eccentric rulers. Rudolf II's descent into obsession began with his education in Spain, where he was exposed to the works of medieval alchemists and astrologers. He became convinced that the universe operated according to hidden principles that could be discovered through careful study and experimentation. When he became emperor, he transformed his court in Prague into a haven for scholars, magicians, charlatans, and genuine scientists, creating an atmosphere where reality and fantasy blended into indistinguishable confusion. His daily routine revolved around alchemical experiments and astrological calculations. He would spend hours in his private laboratory, attempting to transmute base metals into gold and seeking the philosopher's stone that would grant eternal life. He employed teams of alchemists, astrologers, and mathematicians, paying them enormous sums to pursue research that more practical rulers would have dismissed as nonsense. His court became a magnet for every occultist and pseudo-scientist in Europe. The emperor's collection of curiosities grew into one of the most bizarre assemblages in European history. He owned thousands of paintings, sculptures, and mechanical devices, but his true passion was for objects he believed possessed magical properties. He collected supposed unicorn horns, crystals that allegedly revealed the future, and mechanical automata that seemed to move by supernatural power. His palace became a museum of the impossible, where visitors couldn't distinguish between genuine artifacts and elaborate hoaxes. Rudolph's treatment of his courtiers reflected his belief in astrology and magical influence. He would only conduct important business during astrologically favorable periods, and required his advisors to have their horoscopes cast before accepting their counsel. He believed that certain people possessed supernatural powers and would promote individuals based on their alleged magical abilities rather than their political competence. His court attracted every fortune teller and miracle worker in Europe. His relationship with the famous astronomer Tycho Brahe revealed both his genuine interest in scientific discovery and his inability to distinguish between legitimate research and occult nonsense. He provided Brahe with unlimited resources for astronomical observation, while simultaneously funding astrologers who claimed to predict the future from planetary movements. He treated mathematics and magic as equivalent disciplines, unable to recognize the difference between empirical research and mystical speculation. The emperor's personal life became increasingly isolated as his obsessions consumed him. He rarely appeared in public, spending most of his time in his laboratories and workshops. He never married, claiming that romantic relationships would interfere with his spiritual development. He communicated with his subjects primarily through written proclamations, many of which contained astrological advice and alchemical theories that bewildered recipients. Rudolph's mental deterioration accelerated in his later years, as the gap between his magical thinking and political reality became unbridgeable. He believed his alchemical experiments were on the verge of breakthrough, while his empire crumbled around him. Religious wars devastated his territories, but he remained focused on his search for the philosopher's stone. His subjects began to see him as a madman rather than a ruler, and his own family eventually forced him to abdicate in favor of his more practical brother. His death in 1612 AD came while he was conducting an alchemical experiment, his hands stained with chemicals and his laboratory filled with failed attempts at transmutation. He left behind one of Europe's greatest art collections and a legacy of scientific patronage, but also an empire weakened by years of neglect. His court had been a strange hybrid of genuine intellectual achievement and complete delusion, reflecting the mind of a man who couldn't distinguish between knowledge and fantasy. As you sit here now, perhaps in the comfort of your home, the stories of these 15 kings might seem like ancient nightmares, safely contained within history books and scholarly accounts. But power corrupts with the same relentless efficiency, whether it flows through marble halls in ancient Rome or modern boardrooms in glass towers. The tools change. Social media instead of impalement stakes, economic warfare instead of biological weapons, psychological manipulation instead of religious terror, but the fundamental dynamic remains unchanged. These weren't monsters who emerged from some primordial darkness. They were human beings, born with the same capacity for love and reason that exists in everyone. Yet absolute power transformed them into creatures that their own mothers wouldn't recognize. Their humanity dissolved in the acid of unchecked authority. They began as children who laughed and cried and dreamed, and ended as nightmares that haunted their subjects, long after death claimed them. The courtiers who bowed before Nero's burning Rome, the concubines who drowned in Ibrahim's Bosphorus, the peasants who starved while David built his monasteries, they all began their days hoping for simple things, a meal, safety, perhaps a moment of joy. Instead they found themselves actors in tragedies, written by minds so warped by power that they had forgotten what it meant to be human. Tonight, as you close your eyes, remember that somewhere in the world power still flows through human hands. Remember that the capacity for both creation and destruction lives within every heart that beats with authority over others. The only difference between the kings in these stories and the leaders of today is that we've learned to hide our monsters better, to dress our cruelties in the language of necessity and progress. But in the darkness before sleep, when the defenses of civilization grow thin and the whispers of absolute power grow loud, the ghosts of these 15 kings still walk among us. They remind us that the line between ruler and monster is written in sand, easily erased by the winds of unchecked ambition and absolute control. In the end, they were all just men who forgot they were human, and that, perhaps, is the most terrifying truth of all.